My name is Madeline Carter, and I was born in a weathered neighborhood of Savannah, Georgia, where the narrow brick-lined streets hold whispers people don't dare speak aloud. At night, the air is heavy with magnolia and salt from the river, and by morning it smells of warm biscuits drifting out of old cafes. Yet under that gentleness sit stories no one confesses. My mother, Rachel, had me at 19 by accident. She let me know it early, not with words, but with the pauses in her voice, with glances that turned cool before they landed. I grew up inside her sharp remarks, waiting for an affection that never arrived. My father, John Carter, was the opposite, a construction foreman with palms callous like stone but a voice that stayed warm even when it was hoarse from work. When I was 6, my mother vanished. She said she was going to the store and never returned. A neighbor later told us she'd been seen stepping into a car with an out-of-town man. My father came home late that night, and when he heard, he sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of bourbon, staring at the wall. After that, it was just the two of us. He raised me slowly, patiently. Small gifts, a silver bracelet, a scarf with flowers, and he'd always say he'd never let me be alone. But as I grew older, something inside me twisted. I started to need him in ways that felt wrong. Anytime another woman drifted near him, I felt a pulse of anger I couldn't explain. I worked at a small accounting office a block from Ellis Square. That's where I met Lauren Price, a bright woman with bold lipstick and pencil skirts, always talking about her lovers and her plans to move to New York. I listened to her like she was reading from another world. I never told her that my own world revolved around my father. One night after dinner, I lay across his lap as he watched the evening news. His fingers slid slowly through my hair. My eyes closed. Without thinking, I shifted a little closer, my thigh brushing against his. He went still for a breath, then kept stroking my hair as if nothing had happened. But I felt it, that instant crack, something invisible between us. From then on, the nights grew heavier with silence. I stayed near him, searching for warmth. At home, I liked dressing lightly, soft camisole dresses to my knees, sandals leaving my ankles bare. Sometimes I caught his eyes pause there for an instant. One afternoon, I came home from work to find him at the stove. He wore an old t-shirt and an apron, and I startled at how much I liked the sight. I moved behind him, wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my cheek on his back. He smelled of soap, olive oil, and him. "Everything okay?" he asked without turning. "Nothing. I just missed you." His hand found mine, squeezing gently. A shiver raced up my spine. We ate dinner talking about ordinary things, but his eyes seemed to hold words he wouldn't say. That night, before bed, I passed through the living room in a towel, damp hair falling loose. I sat down beside him, the television casting blue light across his face. We said nothing, but the air was charged. When I leaned to say good night, the towel slipped a little more than it needed to. He didn't stop me, but he didn't speak either. That was when I knew I was walking toward fire, and I wasn't turning back. After that, my father began waking earlier, coming home later. He stayed longer at the job site with excuses about deadlines. And when he did return, his greetings were short, like he was locking his thoughts away. I didn't know if it was distance or fear. One afternoon, as I flipped through a magazine on the sofa, I heard him come in. I stood and followed him to the kitchen. He was pulling off his jacket with quick, rough movements, not looking at me. "Are you avoiding me?" I asked, crossing my arms. He opened the fridge, took out a beer. "It's not that, Maddie. I'm just tired. You're lying." His silence burned worse than any words. I walked closer, closing the space between us. His fingers tightened around the bottle neck. "Don't do this," I whispered, leaning in so my arm brushed his. "This isn't a game," he said, voice low and weighted. He stepped back, but I followed, close enough to feel his breath. I was wearing a black linen dress with a slim belt at the waist and high-heeled sandals that clicked softly on the tile. I knew the sound reached him like a signal. "You say it's not a game," I murmured with a half-smile. "But you tremble when I get close." He closed his eyes briefly. "You're too young. You're only 20. Our eyes met, just for a heartbeat, but the room fell away. Then he turned, his voice almost a plea. "Enough, Madeline." I didn't back away. My fingertip traced the edge of the wooden counter as I glanced at him sideways. "Why are you so afraid of me?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. He tried to step back, but I caught his hand. I felt the tightness in his muscles, the silent tug of war inside him. Nothing more happened that day. Or rather, enough happened for me to know the line between us had grown, so thin a single breath might tear it. That evening I dressed differently, a loose cream-colored silk blouse and pale slacks that left my ankle bare. I set the table carefully, small candles, warm bread, a stew I knew he loved. When he came in, he paused for a heartbeat, watching me. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, though his eyes didn't look away. During dinner, he kept his gaze moving, never resting on mine for long. I toyed with the wine glass, tilting it until the liquid caught the candlelight. The air felt charged, like the hush before a thunderstorm. When I rose to clear the plates, I passed behind him and let my hand brush his shoulder. It was no accident. He sat still for a beat, then pulled away. "This can't go on," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "Then look at me and tell me you feel nothing," I replied. He didn't. Days slipped by with barely a word between us. We lived in the same house, but he had turned into a shadow, appearing and vanishing without a trace. I watched him from a distance, more and more certain he wasn't fleeing me but what he felt. One night, I came home late. He was in the kitchen, half a bottle of bourbon on the table and a cigarette burning between his fingers. The soft yellow light caught the lines on his forehead and the weariness in his eyes. "You're late," he said, not harshly but in a low, steady tone. "Got stuck at work," I murmured, sitting across from him. For a while there was only the tick of the clock and the faint crackle of ash dropping into the tray. I coiled a strand of hair around my finger, letting it slide across my lips. "Why are we pretending nothing's happening?" I asked, my voice low. He exhaled and rubbed his forehead. "Madeline, you have to stop." "And what if I don't want to?" I leaned forward, my elbows on the table. His eyes finally met mine, and in them I saw more than exhaustion, a caged longing wrapped in fear. I stood and walked to his side, my steps soft against the tile. I wore a light scarlet dress that moved with each step, and wedged sandals tied at the ankle with black ribbon. I stopped inches from him. "If you won't say what you feel, I will," I whispered, laying my hand over his on the table. He closed his eyes for an instant, his fingers trembling under mine. I leaned close enough for my hair to graze his cheek, my perfume wrapping around him. "You don't understand," he murmured. "I understand everything," I cut in. He shot up suddenly, the chair scraping the floor. He strode toward the doorway, but I stepped ahead and blocked him. We stood there, staring at each other, the air between us electric like the moment before a summer storm. "You can't keep running," I said, unmoving. His jaw tightened. He took a step closer, and for a second I thought he might, but he didn't. Instead, he turned sharply and shut himself in his room. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it. It didn't feel like defeat. It felt like the prelude to something that would eventually break every barrier. The days after were a silent standoff. He avoided being alone with me, and I, patiently, looked for every crack to get closer. I knew his resistance wasn't endless. One humid Sunday afternoon, the heat in Savannah was unbearable. I wore a loose white cotton dress trimmed with lace at the neckline and a thin ribbon at the waist. Barefoot, I let the cool floor soothe my feet as I crossed the house. I found him on the back porch, fixing some tools. Sweat dotted his forehead, and the smell of pine wood and oil hung heavy in the air. "I brought you some water," I said, handing him the glass. Our fingers brushed. "Thanks." He drank without meeting my eyes. I stayed beside him, silent. The late golden light slid over his arms, marked by years of work. I leaned just enough for my shoulder to touch his. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked at last. "Because you're the only thing that matters to me." He stiffened, set the tools down, and met my gaze. There was no anger, only something deep and dangerous. "This isn't right," he whispered. "Then say it again," I murmured. "Look me in the eyes and mean it." He didn't. Instead, he rose, trying to pull away. I followed him into the kitchen. The dim light, our echoing steps, made the air feel thicker. "Madeline!" his voice broke. "I can't." "You can," I said, stepping closer until our breaths mingled. I could feel the wild rhythm of his chest. My hand slid slowly up his arm until one rested on his shoulder. He shut his eyes as though wrestling with something no one else could see. For a heartbeat I thought he would give in, but instead he jerked back, nearly knocking over the chair behind him. "I'm not crossing that line," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes told another story. I stayed where I was, watching as he walked down the hallway. He wasn't just leaving the room. He was leaving because if he stayed even a second longer, everything would change. But somewhere deep down we both knew that line was already gone. The tension had seeped into our daily rhythm. We moved through the house like polite strangers under the same roof, trading short phrases, avoiding anything more than a passing glance. Until one humid July night, when it all shifted. I came home to find him in the kitchen with a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the counter and a cigarette burning down in the ashtray. "You're late again," he said, his voice low, not accusing. "I was walking," I replied, setting my bag on the table. I wasn't ready to come back yet. He didn't look up from the glass in his hand. I stepped toward him slowly, barefoot on the cool tile. My long linen skirt brushed softly around my legs, my light blouse knotted at the waist. "Why are we still doing this?" I asked quietly, breaking the silence. "Because it's the right thing," he said, still not looking at me. I leaned over the table, trying to catch his eyes. "Right for who?" I murmured. "For other people, or for you?" His jaw clenched. I gave a small, fleeting smile, but he didn't react. Then I reached out and took his hand. The calluses on his skin met my palm, and beneath them was a slight tremor. "Look at me and tell me you feel nothing," I whispered. He finally lifted his gaze. In his eyes there was fear, desire, and something I couldn't name. Suddenly, he pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'm leaving," he said, his tone firmer than I'd ever heard it. My heart stuttered. "Where?" "I need time. Distance." I stepped into the doorway, blocking his path. "You're not coming back, are you?" My voice came out softer than I meant it to. He hesitated. "I will. When I can look at you without feeling this." I didn't stop him. I watched him take the keys, open the door, and walk out. His shape dissolved into the dim light of the porch, and the sound of the door closing echoed hollow through the house. That night, the kitchen held a scent like a memory, and I sat there listening to the longest silence of my life. Outside, the warm southern wind rattled the bougainvillea as if trying to carry him back, but I knew that when he returned, we would never be the same. Days slipped by like heavy clouds, each one thick with silence. The house felt larger without him, the walls holding echoes of footsteps that no longer passed. I moved through the rooms quietly, setting cups down where they didn't belong, leaving lights on I forgot to turn off. Nights were the hardest. The sound of the clock ticked louder than before, as if measuring a distance I couldn't cross. Then one evening, As the sun dipped low and the cicadas started their droning, I heard the gate outside creak open. My breath caught before I even turned my head. He was there, standing in the doorway. The same work shirt, the same calloused hands, but his eyes were different. They searched the room until they found me, and then they softened like glass breaking quietly. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured, but he didn't step back. I didn't move either. My fingers clutched the edge of the counter, unsure whether to run or reach for him. In 2 strides he crossed the room. His hands found my shoulders first, then slid down my arms, and suddenly he was holding me, not a careful, polite embrace, but an embrace that shook, as if it had been held back too long. It was a hug that felt like both surrender and apology. His face pressed into the side of my neck. His breath was uneven. "I tried," he whispered, voice rough. "I tried to stay away." I closed my eyes, my hands trembling against his back. He smelled of rain and sawdust and something else, something only ours. For a moment neither of us spoke. The only sound was the cicadas outside and the small hitch in his breathing. He pulled back, just enough to look at me. In his eyes there was no mask left, only exhaustion and a fierce, quiet longing. "I can't keep pretending," he said softly, as if the words were breaking free on their own. His arms tightened around me again, harder this time, like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. I felt the weight of every unspoken thing between us, the years, the restraint, all of it trembling in that single moment. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the edge of something we had already stepped into, together. He stepped back, just enough to breathe, then without a word, walked over to the sofa. The leather creaked softly beneath him as he sat, elbows resting on his knees, eyes lowered like he was still fighting whatever storm lived behind them. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand and patted his knee once, deliberate, wordless. His palm stayed there, open, waiting. My heart stuttered. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That simple gesture said more than any confession. "Come here. Come close. Be with me, if only for this moment." I crossed the room like the floor had turned fragile beneath my feet. As I reached him, he took my hand in his, the way someone takes something they've been afraid to touch for years. He didn't let go. I lowered myself onto his lap, and he pulled me close, close enough that I could feel the rhythm of his heart, fast and uneven. One arm circled my waist while the other slid up my back, steadying me, grounding us both. He held me like he had been waiting forever, like he didn't know if there would be a tomorrow, like it was the last time, and also the first time, he let himself feel what had always been there. The world outside faded into quiet, and in the stillness, he finally let himself need me. His hand moved gently, fingers threading through my hair like he'd memorized the way it fell around my shoulders. Each stroke was slow, deliberate, almost reverent, like he was trying to calm something in himself as much as in me. "You always smell like warm rain," he murmured, the words barely audible against my temple. I didn't answer. I just leaned into his touch, letting the quiet stretch around us. Then his hands moved lower, settling at the base of my neck, his thumbs brushing the edge of my shoulders. He began to knead gently, his fingers skilled and patient, working through the knots I hadn't realized I carried. My head fell forward instinctively, and he smiled softly just for a moment. "I've seen you carry everything," he said under his breath, almost to himself. "You shouldn't have to." The pads of his thumbs pressed in slow circles, finding tension and easing it with care. The way he touched me wasn't hurried, wasn't driven by anything other than the desire to offer comfort, to finally give instead of withhold. I closed my eyes and let him. There was something healing in the way he moved, like he was trying to say all the things he hadn't been able to speak aloud. Like maybe touch was the only language he trusted anymore. And somehow, in that moment, it was enough. His hand slowed, resting gently on my shoulders as his breath warmed the space just behind my ear. For a few moments, he didn't speak. Then, in a low voice, one that trembled slightly around the edges, he said, "Say my name." I froze. His request wasn't forceful. It wasn't even a plea. It was a quiet invitation, a line he was finally asking me to cross with him, together. I turned my head slowly, meeting his gaze. The look in his eyes made my chest tighten, raw, exposed, vulnerable. "James," I whispered. He closed his eyes like hearing it lifted something heavy off his chest. Then he leaned in, his hand cupping the side of my face with a tenderness that made my heart ache. And then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't tentative either. It was everything we had held back for far too long. Soft, certain, a confession and a surrender, all in one breath. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us said anything. Because we both knew. There was no going back now. Only forward.